When World War I began, Woodrow Wilson declared America's neutrality. He said, "This is a European war." This was part idealism, but also because he wanted to trade with both sides. There was an opposition to this neutrality led by Teddy Roosevelt, who opposed German aggression. Most Americans initially, however, supported neutrality. Not all Americans were neutral. Some wanted to enter the war, but some supported the Entente, some supported the Central Powers. Reasons Americans would support the Entente: the common language between us and Britain. Economic and political elites in America had strong ties to Britain. Henry James, you'll recall, had retired to Britain. The wealthy families had married the British aristocracy. Wilson had his long-standing love of Britain's parliamentary system, British government. Germany's lack of democracy was a problem. France and Britain were by far the two great true democracies in Europe, and there were strong economic ties. We traded with both sides, but we had a much greater volume of trade with the Allies. Reasons Americans would support the Central Powers: two very obvious ones. We had a giant Irish minority who hated the English. We also had a giant German minority. There were towns in America that still predominantly spoke German, and they clearly favored the Central Powers. However, these people on the right were less influential and numerous as the people on the left. And the trade situation, which definitely favored the Allies, we had about $800 million in trade with the Allies versus only about $170 million with the Central Powers. And frankly, this 170 went almost to zero as the war progressed because of a British blockade. Despite Kaiser Wilhelm's vaunted navy, the larger British Navy found it quite easy to blockade the Central Powers, because, as you see, there was very little way for Germany to get that navy out in the open sea. Britain and France placed huge orders with the U.S., and the blockade led to a 99% drop in Central Powers exports from the U.S. in just 2 years. The British blockade clearly violated American neutrality. Woodrow Wilson protested search and occasional seizure of American ships, but did not retaliate because that would have hurt the U.S. economy. To counterbalance British naval power, the Germans unveiled the Unterseeboot, the first militarily effective submarine weapon. And they announced in early 1915 they would use U-boats to sink on sight enemy ships en route to Britain. On May 17, 1915, a U-boat torpedoed the British passenger ship Lusitania. It sunk in 22 minutes. 1,198 people died, approximately of whom 128 were Americans. There was no warning. Of course, that's the point of a U-boat. This was called murder. It appeared to confirm the Germans were barbarians. The Germans claimed that there were munitions on the ship. And in fact, that's proven historically to be true. The Germans said the blockade required their use of U-boats. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan said the U.S. should use the Lusitania event to attack both policies, the blockade and the U-boats. He was forced to resign because of this position, and the pro-British Robert Lansing replaced him as Secretary of State. Wilson threatened the Germans, demanding no other attacks on citizens of neutral nations. Germany, fearing American entry in the war, agreed. The question is, should they have done so? In early 1916, merchant ships were armed with guns and depth charges, a new anti-U-boat weapon. Germany renewed its campaign. In March 1916, sank the French liner Sussex, injuring some Americans. Wilson protested, and Germany relented once again, saying they wouldn't shoot passenger ships. This was called the Sussex Pledge, but they said they might resume if the U.S. could not get Britain to allow neutral ships to pass the blockade. And of course, they wouldn't be able to, so the Sussex Pledge was not worth it. The U-boat attack strengthened Teddy Roosevelt's hand, and by 1916, Woodrow Wilson could no longer ignore critics, and he began to prepare for war. It's a policy called Preparedness. He still believed, however, war was neither inevitable or desirable in accelerated diplomacy. He sent Foreign Policy Advisor Colonel Edward House to meet with British Foreign Secretary Lord Grey, yet another Earl Grey. to make a peace plan. This resulted in the House Gray Memo of February 1916. Britain asked the U.S. to negotiate a settlement, but were furious when Woodrow Wilson indicated that he wanted an impartial peace of equals. Britain wanted no business of an impartial peace. They wanted to punish the Germans, and Britain rejected U.S. peace moves, and relations tensed. Now, underlying Wilson's peace efforts were his diplomatic ideals, a new world order, negotiation would replace war, justice would replace power as a fundamental diplomatic principle. He made a major foreign policy address on May 27, 1916, calling for a League of Nations, an international parliament dedicated to peace, security, and justice. While he was doing this, a number of, particularly women, were promoting peace. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and Jane Addams of Hull House fame, founder of the Women's Peace Party. They both opposed the war. In 1915, there was an International Women's Peace Conference at The Hague, which drew many Americans. The pacifists were a broad group of people. There was some Protestant clergy, Midwestern progressives like Bryan and Fightin' Bob La Follette, leading socialists like Debs, and an organization called the American Union Against Militarism. At the Democratic Party convention in 1916, Governor Martin Glenn of New York nominated Woodrow Wilson, praising him for keeping the U.S. out of the war. That became Wilson's slogan, "He kept us out of the war." It's ironic. His Republican opponent was Charles Evans Hughes, a very able politician, one of the greatest Americans not ever to become president. So peace plus more progressive reform, that was Wilson's campaign, and he narrowly won. Emboldened, he sent peace notes to the combatants and asked for terms. Germany did not give any, but Britain and France gave terms that Germany would not accept. It did not appear that peace was very close. On January 22, 1917, Wilson made a speech before the Senate and unveiled his plans for what will later be called the League of Nations. He called this peace without victory. Peace without victors, that's the goal. Only a peace between equals could result in lasting peace. And his principles were very idealistic: freedom of the seas, no more blockades, disarmament, the right of every people to self-determination, nod to nationalism, democratic self-government, and security against aggression. These were very new ideas which appealed to many Europeans. In any case, Wilson's peace efforts came too late. Sensing Russia's collapse, Germany threw its full force against the Western Front, also resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. They knew this might provoke the U.S., but were betting on strangling the Allies before the U.S. could play a major role. On February 1st, 1917, the U.S. broke off relations with Germany. They had said they would do this in the Sussex Pledge if they resumed submarine warfare. On February 25th, Britain intercepted a telegram from the German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, to Mexico, promising that if Mexico would join the Central Powers and attack the U.S., they could get back the Mexican cession at the end of the war. It's kind of a crackpot scheme, but it enraged Americans. In March, news of the Tsar's fall put in place a liberal democratic government under Alexander Kerensky. Now, the communists would remove him eventually, but this eliminated a major objection to joining the Allies, the fact that Russia was an absolutist monarchy. Now, all the Allies were democracies. And so on April 2nd, Wilson addressed Congress and said, quote, "The world must be made safe for democracy," unquote. The vote for war was strong but not unanimous, but he got the vote, and the U.S. embarked on a grand experiment to reshape the world.